My name's Joe Guinan. I'm president of the Democracy Collaborative. Also joining today is my colleague Neil McInroy, who's our global lead for community wealth building. Thank you all for joining us. And we're very grateful to Ben and our colleagues organizing the Next System teach-ins for facilitating this space and working towards the fall teach-ins. If ever there was a need for a Next System and system change, it's surely now. So Neil and I are going to talk for about half an hour between the two of us, and then we're going to be opening up this space for a discussion. So please put yourselves on mute, get comfortable, and we'll all get started. So first of all, next slide, please, Neil. Who are we at the Democracy Collaborative? For those of you who don't know us, we're an action-oriented think-do tank based out of Washington, D.C. and Cleveland, Ohio, but we operate nationally in the U.S. and indeed internationally. And we're working to build a democratic economy through political economic system change from the ground up. And at TDC, we do this through a couple of routes, through, on the one hand, our on-the-ground practice, what we call community wealth building, which we'll be talking about a lot today, and also through interventions in the ideas system and at the level of policy and politics to promote and advance a more democratic economy as a next system of political economy. And we're going to be digging into community wealth building, system change shortly. But just to say, through the lens of our Next System project, we've been working on political economic system change here in the United States and elsewhere for over a decade now. And in fact, all the way back to the 1960s, if you trace our predecessor organizations. And next slide, please, Neil. Obviously, we're coming together at a time where there is so much bad news everywhere. I was just looking at the paper earlier. The Guardian's got a report today on how climate change is about to end capitalism. So we're in a race against disaster to get to grips with the problems that we're facing. But what Neil and I are really here to talk about with you today is solutions, because in many ways, I scarcely think we even need to identify the problems at this point. They're increasingly obvious, even self-evident. We're in a systemic crisis. And when we talk about a systemic crisis at TDC, we're not being rhetorical. What we're facing is not just a crisis of politics or the economy or ecology, but all of them at once in a multifaceted crisis that goes to the heart of our system of political economy. Inequality, cost of living, climate breakdown, rising fascism, collapsing faith in democracy and democratic institutions, systemic racism, poverty, plutocracy, war. But at the bottom of it all, we would argue at TDC, are the operations of our economic system. Everybody knows that the US economy is no longer working for most ordinary Americans. And this is a pattern that's repeated elsewhere across the advanced industrial world. It hasn't done so for a very long time. And if you doubt the truth of that statement, then you're actually in a very small minority today, right? The last several presidential election cycles in America, we've seen supermajorities across gender, age, race, party affiliation, geography, telling pollsters that they hold an unfavorable view of the operations of the economy. Indeed, that they feel that the economy is rigged against them. And let's face it, they're not wrong. Next slide, please, Neil. We're not actually going to talk too much about Donald Trump today because we see Trump, dangerous as he is, as a symptom rather than a cause of the present crisis. But that isn't to say that something new and dangerous isn't happening at the moment. It is. And so I did just want to mention briefly this new tool that we at TDC are using to help ourselves and our allies and partners in sense making and making sense of the moment that we're in. You can subscribe to this tool at trackingthecrisis.org, and you'll receive just one email per week on Fridays, which details all the actions of the Trump administration, as well as movement responses since the previous week's update. And our theory in developing this tool, this tracker, is that what we're seeing is an attempt to flood the zone by doing so much at once, a blitz of shock and awe coming from the administration, its political allies, and that this is in fact a deliberate strategy. So this tool that we've created is intended to release us from reactivity to the news cycle, the outrage manufacturing machine, and allow us to manage the information that we consume so that we can stay informed but not become overwhelmed or paralyzed. So we hope it's useful to you, and please do share it with others if you find it so. That's again at trackingthecrisis.org. So next slide, please, Neil. So back to the underlying drivers of the crisis, the causes of Trump, if you like. I'm not going to run through all the data that we've got. If you want that, you can actually go to our website at democracycollaborative.org. And what you'll find there is something that we publish every 5 years, which we call the Index of Systemic Trends. And this is a data bank of economic, social, environmental, political indicators of the health of the United States, the trajectory of the system overall. And you can find the Index of Systemic Trends online at index.democracycollaborative.org. Again, it's a compilation of publicly available data from government, for the most part, while it still lasts, but also nonprofits that we are bringing together as a kind of dashboard for the overall health and direction of the system over time. And the trends we include in that index include poverty, wealth inequality, racial wealth inequality, income inequality, wage stagnation, the cost of higher education, home ownership, corporate taxation, taxation of the rich, labor union density, incarceration rates, healthcare costs, education costs, climate change, life expectancy, and much, much more. And all of this data is compiled in one place, and you'll see the dashboard warning lights have been blinking red for danger for a long time now. For all the ups and downs of the political or the business cycle, for most Americans, on many very important indicators of economic, social, and democratic health, there's been very little improvement, and in many cases, substantial ongoing deterioration over this period. I'll just show you two charts from this. So first, if you look here, what you see is that the vast majority of workers, using the Bureau of Labor Statistics category of production and non-supervisory workers, that's 7 out of 10 workers, 110 million from a total workforce of 160 million. What you see is that the average US worker hasn't had a real terms, that's inflation adjusted, pay increase since the 1970s. All the gains to the system over a period of half a century have gone to the top. So next slide, please, Neil. So this is a chart that shows the number of respondents telling pollsters that whether they have very little or no confidence in key political institutions going back to the 1970s. And what you see here is the political consequences of running a system in which all the gains go to the top for an extended period of time. It's simply not politically sustainable. There is inevitably a backlash. And at TDC, we argue this is a significant aspect of the current political crisis in America. So if the economy isn't working for most Americans, then it has to be changed. Either that or all our problems will continue to get worse. Next slide, please, Neil. But the question then is, economic system change, that sounds like a tall order. What do we mean by that? Change to what? How do we know that it'll work better? How is it even possible? And so 25 years ago, when the Democracy Collaborative was formed, we set about the work of figuring out political economic system change. And we started from the premise that what was needed was that the fundamental operations, institutions, relationships, and outcomes of the economy are what needs to change. It's our belief that we could no longer work on the basis of what might be called social democratic or liberal redistributive strategies, much as we support all that and would like to see more of it. But we see that as seeking to allow capitalism to produce growth and then clean up around the edges with regulation and redistributive social spending after the fact. And that strategy, while it may have worked for a while for some people, is no longer working. We're now up against an economy whose structural workings increasingly make that impossible. It's like trying to climb up an ever faster moving downward escalator. The institutional arrangements that are at the heart of today's American capitalism, private ownership, credit creation by banks, global capital markets, giant publicly traded corporations, together, these form the most powerful engine for the extraction of value the world has ever seen. And it's this set of relationships, this basic institutional design, that's driving the outcomes that we're seeing in terms of crumbling infrastructure, social atomization, and the widespread sense of popular disempowerment that's behind so much that we're struggling with at the moment. So we determined that if we were serious about addressing real economic challenges, we needed a different set of institutions, a different set of core economic relations capable of producing sustainable, lasting, and more democratic outcomes. A new paradigm, a democratic economy in support of a democratic polity. So next slide, please, Neil. So it's actually incredibly empowering to take up the work of system change. And again, thanks to all the work that's been done to convene these next system teach-ins and this process and this convergence. For us, we believe there are many ways of going about system change, more ways of doing it than are commonly understood. If systems are stalemated or in crisis in the way that we've seen in the United States, the usual paths forward are often proffered as either reform or revolution. But at TDC, we don't actually think that exhausts the possibilities. There's a whole spectrum of ways that we can move forward. One of them in particular, reconstruction, involves a steady buildup over time of institutional alternatives that can grow up and displace the old. And our great colleague and founder, Gar Alpovitz, has written a great deal about this as a theory of system change, evolutionary reconstruction, but also crisis leaps that sometimes can allow us to move forward, not linearly, but in great shifts at key inflection points like the present moment. And I would argue we're also currently seeing an attempt to do something similar from the right, but that's maybe a point for the discussion. So the ultimate point is systems are designed by humans, and that means that they can be redesigned. This is where we turn to the great Ursula Le Guin, who reminded us that for people living for centuries in the era of the pharaohs or the divine right of kings in medieval Europe, it may have seemed that the systems were immutable and unchanging, but they too gave way to system change. As an Irishman myself, I might quote the words of Patrick Pearse, who wrote, "The world hath conquered, the wind hath scattered like dust, Alexander, Caesar, and all that shared their sway. Tara is grass, and behold how Troy lieth low, and even the English, perchance their hour will come." Systems come and go. System change is as common as grass in history. The essential thing to know is how that can happen today and how we might go about consciously doing that work in the face of so many challenges, actually building a system that's worth having and worth living in. And that's the point at which community wealth building comes in. Neil.
Thanks, Joe. And just taking that forward, how do we consciously change the system? And taking that point around Gar in terms of evolutionary construction, this is about what do we do on Monday? How do we start chipping away at this, at the omnipotence of this flawed system? And so community wealth building is the way it's action focused. Its focus is on place and it plugs into um, regional or local economic development activities. So it's taking the big ideas, the big political economy, the big theory, and landing it in place in these policy arenas. And there's a couple of guides we have here. One from ourselves that's about how you advance community wealth building in the USA, and one from Scotland, where I'm from, which is also about implementing community wealth building. So these are guides that practically plug in community wealth building into this local, if you like, economic policy context that starts to chip away and starts to build this evenly construction for the next economic system. We have a long history of community wealth building, and there's a lot of this on our website that I want to hear from yourselves. I won't dwell on it, but basically it started in Cleveland in Ohio 20 years ago. It's been translated to the United Kingdom, and now we're seeing community wealth building as a concept, being talked about across many areas across the world, and also as a practice, actually starting to dig down in many locations too. And I'll talk a little bit about that more in a minute. Here's just a little smattering of some of the places we have community wealth building around the globe. It's growing. Myself and Joe's and colleagues' inbox is testament to its growth in terms of the demand we're seeing for it. And you're seeing people just using the term, people showing interest, but then you're starting to see these national approaches and these deeper, what we call full cream community wealth building approaches happening in many localities. We have a couple of networks that's just worth mentioning in the USA and globally. We have a community wealth building community practice in the USA. It has about 24 locations, organizations involved. We also have a global academic and researcher network, which covers, we have a list of about 150 academics and researchers involved in that network, and we have regular meetings of around 20, 25 people come to that. So there's a couple of networks we have. And in terms of just how we land community wealth building concretely, it's just worth thinking and echoes what Joe's been saying here. Look, community wealth building focuses on wealth. Wealth as a defining feature of our economic system. Where does it go? Who gets it? How do people get their hands on it? How does it work virtuously for the planet? Wealth is our key element, if you like, a key component of how we think about the economy and how we can restructure it and rewire it, if you like. And we know that there's a huge problem of wealth, unprecedented concentrations of wealth at the moment across the world and in the USA. Interestingly, we used to have this. Shows the portion of labour share of income, and the line shows how much people get through earnings, income earnings, as part of the total share of their income, and it's been on a slippery slope downwards for a number of years, and it's not enough here, folks, to talk about jobs and to get money through earning income. We need to think much deeper, because more and more of the wealth is actually disappearing before it comes to us in the form of wages. So wealth and who owns wealth particularly are key facets to consider in community wealth building. And just trying to create a metaphor to make it more readily understood what we're talking about here. In community wealth building, we think about wealth as a flow, like in a hydrological system. So what we're talking about is, how do we make sure that the flow of wealth actually flows to the right places, to the right people, that it nurtures our own human ingenuity and creativity and imagination, that works for the interests of the environment. We think if we can create a better hydrological system, for wealth, then we can actually start to change the whole system completely. Now, in thinking through this question of wealth, we devised what we have as 5 pillars or 5 pipes of wealth, if you like. These are key routes by which wealth flows or doesn't flow to particular localities, to particular communities. So in community wealth building, we look at these particular pillars, these flows of wealth, and start to put in place specific elements, specific policy prescriptions that start to redirect that wealth to act more virtuously and to act more collectively, to act more virtuously for the planet. I'll just quickly scan through these. Now, before I do that, there is one additional element we need to consider in community wealth building, which we call anchor institutions. These are our large public and social institutions who, by their very essence, have they buy a lot of goods and services, they employ people, they have financial investments, they own land and property. They are significant anchors in the economy of place. So they have a particularly important role in thinking through how we rewire wealth within localities. I think around 35% of USA's GDP is driven by public spending, for instance. So you can imagine, if you can redirect that public spending to act more virtuously through the auspice of these anchor institutions, we can start to get better dividends for local communities. So the 5 elements we have here, the first one is around work. So what we put in place in our community wealth building strategies is a range of different elements around the Fair Work pillar, which start to turn the dial to redirect the way that work is viewed and perceived as part of our economy. So we look to have good local hiring, living wages, universal basic income, union recognition, employment charters. These are elements by which we start to think through how do we make work pay and be decent. The second thing we're interested in is to break free from the global financial institutions and its extractive nature of finance, to think about community development finance, credit unions, community bonds, community investment vehicles, a range of different elements that look to create a different type of system that is more generative, more circulatory, more virtuous in terms of how the financial wealth flows within localities and within communities. The third pillar we talk about is land and property, a huge source of wealth. And so you're looking at to collectivize, to cooperativize some of land and property, community land trust, community development corporations, municipal development vehicles, resident-owned communities, community buy-ins. These are all elements that seek to create a wealth from land and property more generative and more circulatory. The fourth pillar is perhaps slightly technical, but this relates to public expenditure, if you like, and looks at the procurement processes. Where does our large anchor organisations buy their goods and services, and who from? Is there social value frameworks? Are they making sure that there's democratic ownership of supply chains? Is there local social organisations receiving those contracts? Again, this is about ensuring that the public spend for goods and services that public bodies need are acting and using that public wealth in a way that truly benefits communities and starts to think through about a different type of an economy that accrues accordingly. And finally, but most importantly, in fact, centrally to community wealth building, is the question of inclusive and democratic ownership in the economy. These forms of enterprises, cooperatives, social enterprises, municipal enterprises, employee-owned firms, are key because by their very nature, they are not extractive. Wealth is retained within the firm and is recirculated back into the firm and into the economy and into the workers and into the community. Now, there's a number of examples. I'll scan through. I'll just very quickly run through because I'm conscious of time. One example is from Preston, which is the poster child, if you like, of the UK's example or England's example of community wealth building. They embarked on a large procurement exercise, that bottom right there, where 6 of the largest anchor organisations in Preston decided to think through their procurement activities so that more local firms, more cooperatives received the goods and services that those public institutions were purchasing. And you can see the shift there from the spend from 5% to 18% over the course of 4 years in the actual Preston city itself. And then from the wider regional change, those changed from 39% to 79%. That shift created around 1,600 jobs. There's also been stipulations around real living wage. We've seen a 9% improvement in life satisfaction through in Preston in recent times. They have a cooperative development network, and they've also started to look at the financial architecture in terms of using local pension funds. And it's not just us saying that it was a good thing. The Preston was named the most improved city in the UK from PricewaterhouseCoopers, did a survey, and this a fairly run-down town, if you like to say it that way, and it's seen the benefit of community wealth building. The other example here I have from Scotland, where I'm from. Scotland now has adopted a national approach to community wealth building. Scotland is the equivalent powers to a US state as part of the United Kingdom. They have a government approach to community wealth building. They have a minister who has a portfolio for community wealth. Community wealth building in Scotland is very much a feature of its economic strategy. A country which suffers from high levels of poverty, inequality, and still remnants of colonialisation as well. So it's seen as a key plank in creating a economic system for Scotland where the economy truly works for all Scots. Interestingly, it's also started to move into particular sectors in terms of the energy renewable sector, specifically in terms of community wealth building, seen as a way how that new burgeoning sector can start to think about the patterns of wealth within that sector and how it accrues community wealth. A few examples globally. I've recently just come back from Australia where there's great interest there. The City of Sydney have a community wealth building discussion paper. They now have a full statement on how they're adopting.
We lost you, Neil.
Because it looks like Neil is there, but not. There we go.
Yeah, there you go.
Sorry, something cut out there. Yeah, at the City of Sydney. Recently, I was in South Korea, where there's 3 or 4 cities are starting to embark on community wealth building. One of our core founder now, one of our core founders, Ted Howard, is now working in Amsterdam. One of the areas of Amsterdam called New West, which is a population of 250,000 people. They have now adopted a community wealth building approach there, and also from Northern Ireland, on the island of Ireland, there is now we did some work there looking at how it could be adopted within the economy within Northern Ireland community wealth building. So there's a range of different areas picking up on it. Just very quickly in the USA, these are all examples for organizations, areas from our network. There's work being done in Seattle, particularly around public procurement, by the People's Economy Lab up there in Washington State. We have WePower in St. Louis, really digging into the racial wealth gap, and they have a full-on community wealth building approach across their organization, working with the city and other anchor institutions there. Kindred Futures in Atlanta, they have an extensive community wealth building program as well, again dealing with the racial wealth gap, and also a small town, Tool-and-Die town in northeast Pennsylvania, it's northwest Pennsylvania, called the City of Meadville, where the whole town has adopted, through a very enlightened mayor, a community wealth building approach, looking at issues around housing, to address some of the housing issues there, as well as some of the aggressive takeovers of some of the tool-and-die firms from bigger companies, and trying to protect local industry through the auspice of CWB. Here's just some of the impact we noted, very selective, of community wealth building. We know that there's a jobs dividend that comes from community wealth building. We've seen a 5% decrease in areas undertaking community wealth building of unemployment. We know you can get greater productivity through employee-owned firms, up to 3 times the national average. That is because there's a better use of capital. Capital is not just used to extracted for dividends, for consumption. A lot of examples of employee-owned firms, the capital, the surplus, is reused in R&D, investing in plant machinery, investing in workers, and that in a sense makes them more productive. I touched upon it earlier, but there's improvement in mental health from the example from Preston. That work was published in the renowned journal The Lancet. And we know there's significant local economic multipliers of small firms receiving contracts. They can generate 25% more benefit to local economy than large firms. That's us. That's all from us. And we'll now open it up to any questions or thoughts. Sorry for the break in the presentation a bit through, then I'll just stop sharing and we can have some questions. Either put your hands up, I think, or perhaps in the chat.
Thanks, Neil. Who wants to go first? Questions, comments?
I'm just looking down the list here.
Sarah, then Gabe.
Hi, so I am friends with people at We Power, a St. Louis organization that is studying how to do community wealth building. And they are taking time to think about how to successfully create worker-owned jobs, essentially, but they really want it to work. They're looking at different models. So I'm kind of wondering, is there a need for a lot of study? Do we already know what works well? Does it all work because any worker-owned job is good? What are your thoughts on strategy?
I'll jump in. Yes, it's great. We Power are part of the network, as alluded to, Sarah. Look, worker-owned jobs, yes, but as a general rule, are a good thing to have. Better to do it that way. In terms of the wider question about evidence, it's something that our global academic research network are digging into, and we've a range of stuff. There's a range of different associated subject matter, if you like, that plays into community wealth building. And that we've surfaced many questions akin to what you've just asked there in that global academic and research network. There is a lot of evidence how different elements in the pillars actually can benefit local economies, are actually a good thing to do. So yeah, we just need to get smarter at utilizing them and smarter in making the case for community wealth building in different contexts. But there is a lot of evidence out there. Does that help?
It's not small scale either, right, Neil? Last numbers I saw, something like 10 million Americans are owners or part owners of their workplaces, and that's more people than are members of trade unions in the private sector. What we definitely want to do is examine the spectrum of ownership in terms of the levels of democracy, how to employee-owned firms that are structured as ESOPs compared to others, cooperatives, et cetera, and there's a potential for a big leap forward in the overall share of the economy that's worker-owned in the next period around something that's discussed as the silver tsunami, which is the retiring wave of baby boomer business owners and what the succession plans are for those companies, and how many of them might we be able to put into democratic ownership through employee ownership, worker ownership structures, etc. So a huge opportunity that if we don't seize will probably result in a lot of those companies either going to the wall because no one's there to take them over, or being gobbled up and asset stripped by private equity, which often happens, unfortunately, in cases of succession. So lots of work to be done there in the future. And thanks for your question, Sarah. Gabe, let's bring you in.
Yeah, so in your presentation, you kind of used the frame of reconstruction. I'm very curious because I like that frame, but at least when I think about Reconstruction, it was a very violent time in American history, a very tumultuous time. Um, how do you view Reconstruction with community wealth building as different from Reconstruction of the Civil War?
Yeah, I think the historical analogy is important, and we should also learn from the shortcomings and the end result of the failure of that model of reconstruction. But I think what we're talking about is getting away from a sort of binary notion that on the one hand, are we trying to reform a system that seems to be set up in such a way as to resist all efforts to produce reform outcomes that would produce improvements, right? And we see that in the data. And at the second, on the other hand, not relying upon either a collapse of the system, although frankly, a collapse of the system is much more likely in the future than it has been, I would argue, at almost any point in American history, given some of the impacts of climate and other things that we were just talking about at the outset. But what I think Reconstruction gives you is a different way of thinking about the question of Monday morning and the long-term system horizon, as Neil was putting it. So Reconstruction allows you to build within the existing system through the use of what is sometimes called structural or non-reformist reforms, to use the Andre Gortz approach, which is changes in the institutional patterns that in and of themselves begin to lead to further changes and to different outcomes. And so there's a process, if you like, and Gar talks about this a lot, of displacement, of pushing out corporate forms, extractive activity, and beginning to take ground for this emerging democratic economy, which, as we were just saying, is not small now, right? 10 million worker owners, right? 1 in 3 Americans in a co-op of some shape or form. A quarter of electricity now being produced by municipal enterprises or by co-ops, etc. But somehow it hasn't yet knitted together. But you know, just very quickly, and then we'll turn to Neil. One example of displacement and reconstruction is really the way in which the evergreen co-ops have developed recently in Cleveland, to the point where the cooperative laundry that was set up with some contracts and commitments from the health systems in Cleveland have eventually grown to the point where they just recently beat out Sodexo, the large multinational company, for the entirety of the laundry contract for the Cleveland Clinic. And what happened when that bid was awarded was that Evergreen was able to step in and take over the plant that Sodexo had previously been operating, rehired all the workers that had previously been working for Sodexo and put them on a living wage and a fast track to employee ownership. And no jobs were lost, but what was pushed out, if you like, the only thing that disappeared was the dividend to the distant absentee shareholders of Sodexo. So you can see there a process by which, by expanding the democratic economy, we begin to push out the extractive economy and displace corporate forms. Are we going to get there one evergreen at a time? I don't think so. I think politics, I think conversations like this, I think all sorts of other shifts have to come together, but we certainly need the models that show that they're capable of going toe to toe with the existing economy and actually winning out for democratic economy forms. Neil, anything from you? And then I see we've got Stephen on stack, and anyone else that I've missed?
Oh, yeah, bring in Steve in a minute. Just for quickly, just to add in that a little bit. There's an interesting, what your question prompted, Gabriel, was a interesting toggle we have in the community wealth building world between the micro, which is the small stuff, the epiphanies of possibilities, we like to call it, doing that small stuff, getting it to work, and then singing about it, and then the macro, which is the bigger economic next system shift. And I think we need the small stuff to kind of make the demonstrations, but we do need to move into bigger political economy questions and bigger political education questions around this as well. It's not just enough doing lots of good little stuff. We need to have that bigger scale up, and that will take more of a political education and political shifts. But we need the armory from those small epiphanies of possibilities to help us in that bigger political change. Stephen.
Yes, thank you. It's a fascinating conversation. The work that you're describing is the work that I've been doing for the last almost 4 decades in the DC area that now has created a model that's replicable throughout the whole country, subject to local specific needs and leadership. So I started out as a supporter housing developer with an intent to help rebuild the underserved communities in DC, take that capital and reinvest it back into supplementary social justice efforts that lined up together and work together with building communities. It's just not housing, it's jobs, it's a whole bunch of other things. It's also getting people out to vote and exercising their democracy. So we created 2 major initiatives. One is the Community Alliance project, where we were literally working with community organizations, faith-based organizations, for-profits that are often in communities that are being disrupted by market forces in the DC The whole city is completely gentrified in the 30 some odd years I've lived there. So the Community Alliance Project is a way to bring change agents, thought leaders, expertise, access to large networks that a lot of small organizations don't have, and help them create the strategies to fulfill their social missions. The other side of the equation, though, of course, is access to capital, and that's universal on almost everything we need to do. So for that, we've created the financial activist movement, where we're literally using our grassroots organizing and networks to work on and build out tools that are now here, like crowdfunding, except crowdfunding's audience is very small. We reach out with our grassroots activism to millions and millions of people at every election with the networks we have. We need to reach out to the same group of people and educate them that their $100 or $1,000 that they're donating to a cause can be invested in communities to fulfill their purposes that reflect their own principles, as opposed to keeping a mutual fund that actually invests in all the things they're against. So the financial activist movement is literally a movement where we're leveraging our entire grassroots networks, and for the small donors, let's reach out to 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 donors to invest in projects that through our Community Alliance projects, we can direct them to that are locally based, backed by local Black and brown leadership, and keep the capital in the communities, wealth building there. However, that's a very tough process if you're not an organizer, which fortunately we are. We're connected to major organizers that have a lot of credentials. The bigger sources of capital, the foundations, the donor advised funds, and others that want to invest in these communities, the problem there is many times they just don't have the expertise or the advisors that are really plugged in and know where to invest their community. So we also need to reach out to them and help them direct real capital into and match up with the partners on the ground that know their communities best, that know their dollars could be extended, and know their dollars will be recycled in the community. So my whole point here is this is a multi-sector process, and working cross-sector is one of our biggest dilemmas. I'm a housing developer. I'm an organizer. I'm a social justice activist. I'm an arts entrepreneur. No one could ever figure out where I'm coming from because I work in so many different sectors. The point here is those on this call today, I assume, come from a lot of different sectors. We need to come together. We don't need the status quo's permission to rebuild our own communities. We need the right tools, leaderships, and the infrastructure, the ecosystems, which with initiatives like this are finally happening, but we need to accelerate it. And it's driven by, aside from local leadership and opportunities, capital, access to capital. One last thing I'll say is the typical nonprofit paradigm, which never works, but we keep using it. The local organization, community development corporation, finds a problem, they address it, and they try to imply a solution. And the solution almost always requires capital. So you acquire a property that or want to acquire a property that could use development, housing, and a whole bunch of other things, and takes 2 or 3 years to put a capital stack together. That is not how you rebuild communities. The open market knows how to build communities because they'll bring the capital and they'll get it done in a heartbeat. So we need to start using conventional strategies with capital and local leadership to be an alternative to the status quo. And then the status quo will begin to realize, wait a minute, what they're doing is actually profitable, and maybe we should start looking at that as more of a model we can invest in. So I just want to say social enterprise and organizing and capital all need to come together in a cohesive way. Thanks for the opportunity.
No, Stephen, that was fantastic, and nothing to add really, apart from that, it seems like great work you're doing, and I suppose the only reflection I've got in terms of to be intentional about the approach you're talking about as you are, and one of the ways we carve that up is to think about the movement that needs to happen. So that's the activism, the practice that needs to happen, the kind of show, and also how it relates to policy and big capital and big finance. And to think through about all those things, and you're doing it, Stephen, so fair wind in your sail. Seems like maybe an organisation like yourself to get involved more in our community practice might be something we can think about moving forward.
We're building a permanent infrastructure that is really there, except we're not connected. We're like the French resistance during the war. We have a common enemy, unfortunately, to like what we have today, but we're not connecting or even knowing that we exist with each other. Once we start coming together, even with the lack of resources, we could
100%.
defeat, shall we say, the underlying problems we've all been facing. And that's what we need to do. It's not magic. It's not pixie dust. It's really capitalism. I hate to say that to some of the socialists on the call here today, but it's carrying capitalism done in a way where common good, everyone benefits. And that's what we need to promote. And we have the expertise to show that we're not just the dreamers. We know how to do real estate housing development within the most drug-infested, crime-ridden neighborhoods in DC. It could be done, and everyone benefited. So that needs to be a national priority, given all the communities that are disinvested in America.
No, thank you. Thanks for that. Anyone else for anything else? No.
Ben, you want to come in and say something and also
Yeah.
start to bring us into land and
Yeah,
situate this?
I guess I wasn't intending to situate it. I was actually struck by something, but I can do a little bit of that as well. I was just noting that there are quite a few people who are in Canadian cities who are on this, who are here today. And I was just thinking about the Canada-US dynamics, and not so much in terms of Toronto Blue Jays versus Washington Nationals and people booing and so on, but or the Blue Jays. I remember in 1992 flying the American flag upside down and in the World Series, and playing CCR's Bad Moon Rising, which was kind of about rioting, but it's not about that. But it's more just about cross-border cooperation and finding ways to build more synergies between people and communities in the United States and communities in Canada. And I'm just wondering what that looks like from the Canadian perspective at this point. And if anybody had anything to share. So that's just what came to mind for me, and hoping to enlist some of those voices. And then because a lot of the networks and organizing that I'm most connected to are between Milwaukee and Philadelphia and Richmond and so on, and there's very little that goes on between Milwaukee and Toronto or Thunder Bay and Minneapolis. So that's a question. And I've always found those connections to be really empowering and enlightening when they're made. And then just in terms of what you raised, Joe, I just do want to recognize this as part of this larger gathering today and tomorrow. And I think everybody has the information about sessions at other points today. But if you don't know about other things that are happening at the Convergence, then please do go to nextsystem.org. I put the link in the chat. Register. You'll get an automatic responder with all the Zoom links for the rest of the day and for tomorrow. And so far, this has been a really great experience. And I'll just want to thank you, Joe, and you, Neil, for putting this session together, which I think is really valuable. But yeah, question for my Canadian cousins. And I do have actual Canadian cousins as well. So if they were here, I would be asking them.
Anyone want to take Ben up on that? Any voices from Canada? Otherwise, Neil, I'm going to ask you to say a little bit about what you've been up to in Canada in recent times.
I can
please.
Hi, my name is Valentina and I'm connecting from Toronto. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Toronto. It's a bit hard to embody the response from Canada, but I just want to say that I think the kind of conversation we've been having in this moment and with organizations involved in community building and in developing idea of inclusive economies, which is what I work on, is of course also reacting to the news and trying to make sense of the tariffs and of the shifting landscape. So the idea of economic sovereignty comes up, but the way in which it's framed is framed in through the lens of keeping the wealth local, or just trying to fostering basically what people have been doing all along. So of course there are new threats, but there is also a way of just confirming how important it is, the kind of work that people have been doing. So I would say that that's the kind of reactions that we're witnessing. Yeah. But thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Neil, you want to say anything about some of the things that we've been interacting with
Yeah.
in Canada, just to put those on the map as well?
Yeah, Canadian academics have been very active in the Global Academic Research Network, and one of the things I detect from Canada is that there's two things. Firstly, community wealth building is being taken up through a maturing of a community development approach to something that's more about community economics. And I think I see a transition where the traditional type of community developments have the community developed, so forth, but creating an economic damage to that is something I think is the offer that community wealth building brings, and I've seen that picked up in Canada particularly. And the second thing is through the burgeoning energy renewable sector, particularly in British Columbia and in New Brunswick, where you're seeing the growth of community ownership, municipal ownership, cooperative ownership of energy renewables. We're seeing the potential we're seeing community wealth building being talked about, as a concept within that sector, I think, as I alluded to earlier. So I think that's that would be my Canadian reflections really in terms of their relationship to this agenda.
Thanks, Neil. Just to pick up on the question of trade and the tariffs as well, which Valencia talks about. I do think that part of the importance of these conversations, and of course we're getting started today, but the aim is to move towards a whole array of teachings in place and online around the world in the fall. The importance of these networks and of these conversations are to understand the new old forms and challenges that are emerging at the moment. And I would argue that neither neoliberal trade in the way that we've seen it for decades and that has deindustrialized the US Midwest, nor the new forms of economic nationalism that are being touted by the right wing are in any way the right solutions or responses to the problems that we find. But we're going to find ourselves on opposing sides of trade wars in which we need to find common interest in terms of tackling the root causes of those problems rather than falling into line with our own national sovereignty around those. And that's going to be complicated and tricky. We've actually just been talking to Michael Hudson, who some of you may know his longstanding work on international trade and also his historical work. I feel like the Trump administration has been reading Michael Hudson's work and cherry picking aspects from it. He's got one book in particular called America's Protectionist Takeoff, which describes the economic approach of certain sections of American capital during the 19th century that allowed for industrialization in the face of British free trade, etc. And there's some weird echoes of those arguments coming through in what I think is actually a pretty confused and mixed up strategy emerging from the Trump administration. But it's going to pose some real immediate cross-border challenges for not just Canada, US, but US, Europe, Britain, Ireland, lots of other places, Australia that we've got connections with, South Korea, etc. So looking forward to deepening in these cross-border conversations about our common economic responses and challenges so that we don't simply get recruited into one side of an economic trade war that isn't actually being waged in our interests. We're coming towards the end. Neil, any final words that you want to leave people with in terms of how to interact with TDC's community wealth building programs?
Well, on the TDC website, there's lots of material. I mentioned the guide, so just keep your eyes on there. But thanks so much for your time today. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks for your questions and thoughts.
Really appreciate all the work that's been done to put this convergence together. Thank you, Ben, Gabe, and others. Thank you all for coming. Really enjoyed being in space with you and looking forward to building towards not just next system teachings, but a next system starting in the fall. Ben, last word?
Absolutely, yes. And there is actually a session that's concurrent with this one that our friends at the University of Vermont Leadership for the Ecozoic are undertaking. So I'm going to jump over there. And if you're registered, you should have received a link to that session if you'd like to go over there. If you haven't registered yet, just go. You'll get the autoresponder. You'll get the links. Thanks so much again to the Democracy Collaborative for all the leadership all these years and in the years to come. And thank you all for all the work that you do that is evident in the conversation we've had today. So
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everyone.